Hello, and welcome back to the Mixtape with Scott, a podcast where I delve into the story of the economics profession as told through the personal narratives and untold stories of the people who have devoted their lives to the profession, living economists. I am your host, Scott Cunningham. Ordinarily, the interviews are with living economists. This week is different. It is with Dr. William Spriggs, who died June 6, 2023. It's a very special episode, therefore. We're taking a step back in time to 2019. I was at the American Economics Association's conference for mentors and mentees. That summer, I had decided I wanted to start interviewing economists and learning their stories. I felt like that was something that was missing. I wasn't sure exactly why I wanted to do it or with whom, but I went to the conference with an iPhone and some mics that I bought online. And as soon as I saw Dr. William Spriggs, who I'd seen before and spoken with a lot on Twitter, I knew that I wanted to make him the first person I interviewed. So I asked him if I could interview him for my project, and he graciously agreed. So for 2 hours, we talked about his life. If you aren't familiar with Dr. Spriggs, here's some facts. He was a man with a resume, unlike many economists. He was an academic and a public servant and a person who rallied for justice. He was a professor of economics at Howard University for many years. He was chief economist at the AFL-CIO, and he was assistant secretary for the Department of Labor in the Obama administration. His contributions to labor and public policy were instrumental in shaping our understanding, our collective discussion of racial inequality, income inequality, and labor market dynamics, particularly within the profession, but I think more broadly too. He was a vocal economist, though, about racism, structural racism. He didn't talk about it in the categories that economists talk about it, like Beckerian discrimination or statistical discrimination. He was much more blunt about its existence and the damage that it did to people's lives and the inequality that it created in this country and also within the profession of economics. He spoke with real courage and so much moral force that I think it made a real impression on everyone who heard him. It definitely did with me. Every now and then there seems to be someone like that in America, and Dr. Spriggs was definitely one of those someones, at least within the economics profession right now. We lost him recently. I know that he was beloved by many people, so I'm very grateful that I finally, after a month of searching, found the interview buried in my Dropbox folder. Makes this conversation, I hope, even more poignant. Listening to his insights about his life, his passion, his dedication. It's a reminder of the significant influence in the world of economics and beyond. Thank you. I hope that you find this time to listen to Dr. Spriggs' life story and the things he cares about as interesting as I did. I'm your host, Scott Cunningham.
Dr. Spriggs, so this is for a series I'm going to have on YouTube called What Economists Do. And I just wanted to have a casual conversation about your life as it relates to economics. So it's really like about your personal story. So I want people to hear your personal story, but then it veers into the professional to narrow it down. Okay. So I was wondering if we could just start off and you tell me a little bit about yourself. We're just going to start with something kind of easy to talk about. What are some of your fondest specific memories growing up, whether it's adolescence or high school?
Well, I'll give why I ended up being an economist.
Okay.
So I grew up in Washington, D.C., and while I was growing up, my father was finishing his PhD in particle physics, and my mother was a public school teacher. She started out in Washington as a Head Start teacher and then went into the public school system. Both my parents served.
What year would that have been?
My father earned his PhD in 1960. I was born in 1955.
Okay.
So that's the cauldron in which I was born, Washington of that period. Both my parents had served in World War II. My father was a Tuskegee Airman. My mother was a sergeant in the motor pool. She was a WAC. So here's the irony of life. My father had decided, based on what his high school teachers had told him growing up about the experience of being a soldier in World War I, that they had been drafted, given very short time to prepare, and then were sent overseas. And understanding what was brewing in the world when he was growing up, he graduated high school in 1942. He fully understood. Well, let me back up, because he finished in 1939. Fully understanding in 1939 what was happening in the world, he decided he better volunteer, because he wanted to be trained ahead of a war starting. So actually, he was in the Army when Pearl Harbor occurred. He had already volunteered.
Wow.
But because the Army was segregated, they decided that the black troops of the time would fit the segregated Army of the time. So he actually was a Buffalo soldier, an honest to God member of the 9th Cavalry. Cavalry with the real cavalry, meaning that he actually was on a mule, not
Oh my goodness.
not in a jeep, and not jumping out of parachutes.
Wow.
And so he was fascinated by radio, which was the internet of the day when he grew up, and he wanted to be a radio man. And because of his skills, they transferred him from the cavalry to Tuskegee. And initially they were, at that point, training an African-American bomber group. So he thought he'd be a radio man for one of the bombers, but his psychological test was, no, you're a fighter pilot. So he was trained as a single-engine fighter pilot, and graduated as a lieutenant, as a single-engine fighter pilot. My mother's the sergeant of the motor pool.
Oh my goodness.
Neither of them could drive a car.
He could drive a plane, but not a car.
Right. And my mother was the sergeant of the motor pool, but she couldn't drive a car. Neither of their families owned a car.
Wow.
At the time they were the time that they had signed up for the war. And my uncle, in the interim, of course, the war years provided more prosperity, and my dad's brother could drive a car, and the family had a car. So when they were released on, when my dad was released on leave, because my mom was stationed in his hometown of Des Moines, my uncle would drive them around on their dates, because neither of them could drive. But I say all that to say, so if you can understand the context of someone with the bravado to be a fighter pilot, but the oomph to be a PhD in particle physics.
Sure.
And my mother, in order to graduate from high school, her county, which is now the city of Virginia Beach, but was then the county of Princess Anne, did not have a black high school. So in order for her to go to high school, her parents had to pay money, put her on a trolley to go to the city of Norfolk to graduate from high school. So if you can comprehend that and appreciate that, then you get the sense of the fortitude, the bravery, and the sense of purpose that they had growing up in a household like that.
Wow.
Every adult in my family served in World War II, including not just my mother, but my aunt. Her sister was sent overseas after we lost my mother's brother, who was lost in Normandy in July, right after the D-Day invasion. And my aunt was one of the few members of the 688, this is all black female unit that was sent overseas, the only all-female unit deployed. There were other women who were deployed, but they were part of a male unit. So, there were nurses who were deployed, there were communications people who were deployed, but they were part of a male unit. So they weren't a full battalion. Mm-hmm. So that means that they didn't have their own MPs, they didn't have their own motor pool, those were male jobs. But this unit, the 6888, this was a battalion, this was all women. And she was deployed in late 44, after D-Day. The mail had piled up, because as you can imagine, they're ripping across Europe, and the last thing they thought about was, who's going to deliver the mail?
Sure.
So it piled up at a warehouse in England.
Oh, wow.
And they sent over these black women to sort it out.
Okay.
Which, you say, oh yeah, sort of the mail. But remember that Americans of the time period were kept in the dark about their men. They just knew there was an APO box and you just send it. So you send it to Paul Jones.
Right.
And
so this was, they weren't just sorting into addresses, they were figuring out who these people
yes, which Paul Jones,
right.
which John Smith.
Right.
Right?
Wow.
So this is not simple
It's
to
not
do.
trivial.
Yeah, to try and make sure it was going to go to the right Paul Jones, the right John Smith.
It's important work, but but a lot of people don't know about it.
Yeah, and they cleared this huge backlog in very short order while they were in England, and then as soon as northern France was secure, then they sent them over to Reims, and after reclaiming Paris, they were sent to Paris. So when I'm saying, my entire, I mean, including the women, I had an uncle who was in the Philippines and another uncle who fortunately lived through being in the European theater and came home.
Well, so what values does that create for a young man growing up in a sort of a legacy in a family like that, mm-hmm. in you?
Well, a deep optimism about the country, very deep optimism about the country. Because remember when my dad came home to use his GI Bill, even though he was from Iowa, he came to Virginia, where my mother was from. He could not go to the University of Virginia.
They did not allow African Americans to.
The school was still segregated there.
Right.
So, so you just have to understand the optimism that it takes to have served your country in war,
and to continue to overcome those kinds of obstacles and believe that you're capable of such thing as the highest level of science.
Well, but to believe in your country,
right?
Which is not telling you fully, thank you. We're glad you risked your life for us. Mm-hmm.
So, you feel like you internalized that kind of optimism?
Yeah.
Okay.
No? Absolutely.
Oh, you had? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
What does it look like in your life?
I mean, the fact that I've served in government, and I'm proud when I represent the United States. I still think among the bigger highlights of my career have been representing the United States and being in some international forum and understanding that I'm speaking on behalf of the United States, and to have someone call on me the United States.
Right.
It's a big deal, feels good.
Yeah.
And the fact that I believe in policies that benefit all Americans. Mm-hmm. That comes out of that upbringing.
Right.
So I have no stomach, though, for people to say, love it or leave it. It's like, no, you don't. You have not earned the right to say that.
Right.
You serve in a segregated army.
Right.
You come home to segregation. Then you've earned the right to tell me love it or leave it.
Right.
But the rest of y'all shut up.
Right. Right.
I don't have the stomach for it.
Right.
So that's the background, a belief that the country can live up to everything that it promises, that this is a country that has the ability to be the best, and a belief that it will be the best and can be the best, and those are American values. So that's what I think people should sort of understand from growing up in a household like that. But Washington at the time, this is the height of the civil rights movement. I tell my students, they think of athletes as heroes, but I remind them when I was growing up in Washington, the Senators were still totally a segregated team. They were all white, the baseball team of the time. The Redskins, the football team, was all segregated. The owner of the Redskins, in fact, traded away the first round draft. He didn't want to have to be forced to draft the Heisman Trophy winner, Ernie Davis, who was lauded as the best running back ever from Syracuse. And mind you, Ernie graduated after Jim Brown. So when people say this was the greatest back, this is the greatest back compared to Jim Brown.
Right.
And he didn't want him.
Yeah, right.
So it's like, I don't want to integrate my team. I'm going to trade away the first round draft choice.
Wow.
Because I don't want him.
Yeah.
So, so it's not like I grew up in a time when black athletes were flooding the world as role models, except that they were breaking barriers, and the view of them actually wasn't the way we view them today. They were very much civil rights icons because it was clear they were breaking racial barriers. It wasn't like you're going to spend all your time on the basketball court because you think you're going to be LeBron James. You understood that, yeah, you and two other people.
Right. It's a long fight.
It's a long fight.
You grew up in a long fight.
Right.
You have to have a long horizon to be able to handle that.
Well, because, I had, this unique opportunity of this window where my grandparents, both my grandfathers were janitors. My mother's father was a gardener. My grandfather, for whom I'm named, had been a janitor. And yet, here are their kids. One a PhD in physics, and the other this wonderful public school teacher in an integrated school. And we would move back later to my mother's hometown, and here she is, this wonderful school teacher in an integrated school system.
Right.
So I fully understood this is a huge distance in not only my parents' world, but then my parents' world compared to their parents. But the heroes of the day were these civil rights leaders, and fortunately for me, I grew up on a very unique street. So there was my dad. Next door to us was my pediatrician, and next door was the chair of the math department at Howard University, and his wife was a law professor at Howard. And these lawyers were my heroes because I fully knew that every time somebody said, oh, this is the first black person to get this job, or this is the first black person to move in that neighborhood, or this is the first time black people have been able to ride, this streetcar, it was because those lawyers who either taught at Howard, graduated from Howard, or were faculty members at Howard, had won some lawsuit.
Right.
And as a result of those lawsuits, all these things were happening. And the black newspaper of the day, this is, front page news, First, they would have some young black woman who was, a clerk at some department store. And, she would be a hero for, her 5 minutes of fame was she got hired as a clerk at a department store, which is a big deal.
Yeah.
So I wanted to be like them.
For like breaking barriers, or
I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer.
Right.
I understood they were the ones making it happen, and I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. Well,
so this was college, or even before college, you're thinking, I want to be a lawyer.
When I was
little.
Okay. These were the people because this law professor lived down the street, these are the people I grew up around. This is what I wanted to do. Then when it came time for high school, for leaving high school, going to college, that's what I still wanted to do. But this family friend said, we already won all the cases. Like, you have no value added here. We already desegregated the schools at this point. the Swan case had already been ruled. Busing had already obliterated segregation. They had torn down the final vestiges as I was entering middle school of segregation.
So you experienced busing firsthand when you were little?
Yes. Because we moved from Washington. Washington integrated its school system almost immediately. It was not exactly a member of the Brown case. There were a couple of companion cases that were a little different, hinged on a different part of the law. The Brown decisions were on equal protection. The DC case was on a slightly different issue, and the Delaware case was a slightly different issue. DC gave in. So when I started kindergarten in '60, DC had already desegregated, but my neighborhood, which had been white when we moved in, the three of us, quickly became all black, and actually my elementary school, I think there were maybe 4 white families left.
Right.
But when we moved to Norfolk, when I was in the 6th grade, they were still doing massive resistance. So what the initial response in Virginia was they shut down the public school system.
Oh, wow. In regards to busing?
Yeah, well, yes, because their refusal was, we're not going to integrate schools.
Right.
And our answer is, that's because we don't have them.
Yep. It's an easy solution there. You just get rid of you solve the problem just by getting rid
Yes,
of it.
if you're saying equal protection means that if we give people public education has to be integrated, fine, we won't have public education.
Yeah.
Solved.
Right.
Which of course wasn't solved because there are too many poor whites in Virginia. They realized.
So a lot of private schools opened up?
Lots of private schools opened up.
I grew up in a town in Mississippi where there was the Brookhaven Academy, and it was, had that history.
Yeah. So they gave up on that rather quickly in some counties. Other counties, Prince Edward County, gave up way late. They left their schools shut way into the 60s. Wow. But the other school districts operated under what they called freedom of choice. So their thing was, our schools aren't segregated. If a black student wants to attend a white school, we will let them.
Okay.
But they continue to operate dual systems. So the teachers had a separate pension fund. The school systems had separate leagues. So the black students did not, the black high schools didn't play the white high schools. And in fact, the movie, Remember the Titans, was very misleading.
Oh, really?
About what the plot was. They portrayed what happened as only T.C. Williams integrated. And they were the only integrated team in Virginia. That was not the truth at all at the time. What was unique to T.C. Williams was they kept the black coach. And
they kept him because he was so talented? Or was that some sort of compliance with external pressure?
No. I'm not sure all of what went into that decision, because in all other instances, they got rid of the black coaches.
Okay.
He was unique because not only did they keep him as a coach,
kept his staff,
but they kept him as the head coach.
Oh, okay.
And the movie made a big deal about the friction caused by him being the head coach.
Yeah.
But if the movie had been fair, you would have understood the context in which that occurred, because in everywhere else, in Fairfax County and the city of, well, Arlington County, the black coaches disappeared. Not even as assistant coaches, they disappeared. They were assigned to other
With the integration of the schools,
right,
they got rid of the African American coaches.
Because they were in any school system, right? That's the man with authority. That is an authority figure.
Interesting.
Right? And when you look at most high schools, principals come from football coaches. I mean, this is disproportionately the channel by which you get to be a high school principal.
Right.
And so that was missing the movie. Further missing from the movie was because the players lost their coaches, though this is picked up in the movie a little bit, right, is the issue of like who's going to be quarterback.
Yeah.
Who will have these skilled position roles.
Yeah.
And if the movie had been fair about it, they would have let you understand that, yes, these other schools, they are integrated, but there's a difference between.
There was a shuffling of African Americans sort of down.
Yes.
On the same team, but not in the skill positions or benched and things like that.
Exactly.
Right.
And in the end, and this gets to the schools didn't play each other. These were separate leagues. The Virginia High School League was the white high schools, and the Virginia Interscholastic League was the black high schools. As they slowly put in place busing, in a couple of cases, the black high schools were too big, and the school systems blacks were too big a share of the school system to shut down the black high schools.
Right.
So Booker T. Washington High School in Norfolk, Maggie Walker High School in Richmond, blacks are a big share of Norfolk and of Richmond, I.C. Norcom High School in Portsmouth. So you have these few high schools that are left and these few black coaches that are left. So then they had to figure out, how are we going to get the black schools into the schedules of the white schools?
Right.
There was huge fights over this.
Yeah.
Because from the white high school's perspective, well, we only play 9 games a year.
Right.
So if we put you in the schedule, some famous rivalry that we have can't take place.
Yeah.
And initially they wanted to not let them play. So there were a lot of deep undercurrents going on that movie missed by simplifying it and making it as just,
This was your environment. This was high school for you.
That was high school for me.
Got it. So you experienced a lot of this change in the school system, and then it was playing out in a very unusual way within the athletics department.
Yes, and in the lives of the students,
And
right?
in the lives of the
Because expectations were going to have to change.
Right.
People have to remember the Wilmington 10, and this sounds strange if you try and explain it to somebody. This was over the flag girls, for marching bands in high school. How there are these jobs where you have these flags that go with the marching band. In the case of Wilmington, they didn't want to let the black girls do that. In the case of most of the schools, black girls being a cheerleader, like this is no, absolutely not, no.
Right.
Not only no, but like you must be certifiably crazy.
Right.
You have a mental illness if you think that there ought to be.
Right.
Like there's something wrong with you. Why do we have to explain this to you?
Right. Right.
Like why don't you get this?
Right.
Like this is obviously not right thinking on your part.
Yeah.
So that was the other thing unique in T.C. Williams was they had these black cheerleaders, which is like, so there are a lot of subtleties that the movie missed by not appreciating the full story that they could have told, and they're watering down and simplifying it, masked.
Right.
Masked out. So here I am finishing high school.
Yeah.
And I want to be a civil rights lawyer.
And I'm sure those experiences only intensified that desire.
Yeah, because from my interpretation, great, you guys won the case, but here are all these other issues
Now there's this.
that are on the table that you should have been thinking about.
There's a lot more to do.
Yeah, that there's more to do, and they were like, no, because we already, we won these things, and so this very close friend of the family was what we haven't done, what we have not solved is the economic issue. And you know, as much as we celebrate what we've done, we understand there's a limit, because as much as we've opened up opportunities, we, these lawyers, we fully understand that there's this huge economic disparity. We haven't touched it.
Right.
And we need economists to tell us, how do you do that?
Right. Right.
So she was quite adamant, no, you got to be an economist.
Oh, okay. So who was this that told you this?
This is a friend, Goler Butcher, who was a brilliant international lawyer. She
Did she see something in you that made her think that you would be talented at that, or was it more like, this is what's needed, and you should do this because there's this need for it?
The Butcher family and my family, remember, grew up next to each other. Our family values were very similar.
Right.
And in her family, the famous saying was, "Did you bring your A game?" And the answer is supposed to always be, yes, I brought my A game.
Sure.
They did not have low expectations of any one of us. They treated us like their children.
Yeah. But
so
there was a belief that there was a greater need for an economist than another
a lawyer.
I
Yes.
see.
And so
There was a scarce. So they knew. What did they? What was it that they were thinking? An economist. What were they thinking that you could do as an economist that you couldn't do as a lawyer? What were they imagining?
well, they were convinced that it were the rules of the economy created these disparities.
Okay.
And that even if you opened up opportunity, these rules that they didn't understand
Yeah.
needed to be tweaked or fixed or turned in some way,
Right.
so that the system would operate in a fair way.
I see.
And someone had to understand, what are the barriers we're not picking up,
Yeah.
and what creates them, what justifies them, what lets them continue, and tell us, and then we can figure out the policies and the laws.
Right.
But somebody has to point us in the right
So
direction.
your desires stayed the same, but you learned of this new vocation where you could accomplish many of those same things, just in a different vocation.
Right.
Okay.
But so the twist was that she's this famous international lawyer, and she ended up being, Goler Butcher ended up being the head of the Africa Bureau for AID.
Okay.
Her most significant contribution for everybody was she was the counsel to the Congressional Black Caucus and their Committee on Africa.
Yeah. Okay.
And she is the one who pointed in all the directions to undermine apartheid.
Oh wow. Okay.
So they the faculty at Howard would gather with the CBC on how is the United States going to bring down apartheid. Well, that got me all into international issues, and I really wanted to do development. I wasn't as I wasn't as concerned with solving these problems that she really thought I should have been
in
concerned.
the United States.
In the United States.
You were interested in developing countries or Africa in particular. Right. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So when I chose which undergraduate school to go to, I chose Williams because Williams had a Center for Development Economics.
I see.
And they had that focus in their faculty. Fortunately for me, they decided when I was a senior that the students at the center were being too segregated away from the undergrads, and they wanted to try and find a way to let the fellows at the center get a sense of, what is the rest of the college doing.
Right.
So they let two of us, one of my classmates, Michael Opong Kusi, Michael's brother, had been a graduate. He had been a fellow earlier, and they let the two of us stay at the center. So my senior year, I spent at the center, and I got to take classes in development economics. And when I was choosing graduate schools, that's what I was looking for. I was looking for a graduate school that was strong on agricultural economics and could do good development work. And so that's how I chose Wisconsin.
Okay. So you were still at that point interested in development.
Right.
So you spent years planning and investing in that kind of human capital
Right.
and that kind of track.
Right.
Okay.
My junior year at Williams, they had a program that would help students who wanted to go into public service, and so I was fortunate to win the access to that program, and they placed me at the United Nations Development Program.
Okay.
So I worked in the Africa office
As
of
a
the-
college student, as a junior?
as a junior.
Wow.
So I worked as a summer intern at the United Nations Development Program in the Africa unit, helping them to scan programs and helping their senior people in preparing reviews of programs that they had funded. So I got a sense of what the development work was and what a development program looked like. And then I got to Wisconsin, and one of my study friends, graduate students in economics, you can't make it on your own. You really have to be part of a team. So
This is a colleague, a classmate?
a classmate
He's saying that.
Hap-
What's
hap-
the context for that?
happened to be an employee of the Central Bank of Nigeria.
Okay.
So this is one of my study buddies.
Yeah.
And my experience with him made me quickly aware that, as romantic as I wanted to paint all this stuff, context matters a ton.
Yeah.
If you think you're going to go somewhere and say, "Oh yes, I've studied this economics, and you just do this," and so that was the end of me in development economics.
Really? Was that
Yeah.
hard to sort of say goodbye to what you've been doing for years and years?
No.
You were ready. You
I,
weren't.
no, I, no, I, that was a lesson in humility.
Okay.
That I clearly didn't understand enough.
Yeah.
And
I understand that.
yeah, and I'm still, I mean, I didn't drop out of econ.
Right.
It was just an understanding of what do I know, and that was when I decided, no, I should concentrate on something here in the U.S.
Yeah.
Because that context I know.
I understand that.
And labor was the logical area, because that is where the disparity is obvious immediately
Right.
in black and white experiences.
Right.
And the majority of income for all Americans comes from labor income,
Right.
but even more so for African Americans.
Sure.
And that was my first taste of being a labor leader, because
At Wisconsin?
because I was pulled into the leadership of the teaching assistants. We had a 1-month strike.
Wow. So you've been working with unions for a long time.
Yes, and so that was my baptism under fire.
Interesting. Y'all were wanting more pay or
No,
less
no,
hours
no,
or
no, no.
something?
So this was the late 70s, and the country was going into recession. Wisconsin was facing budget crises, and the response was, how can we cut cost? And some of the departments that were facing this tension the greatest were the ones that, as you can imagine, right, don't generate the money for the university. So
Right.
French,
Right.
right, Spanish. And what those departments decided was, well, instead of paying our teaching assistants,
Yeah.
you know what? This is now a requirement for graduation.
Little moving stuff around.
Yes.
A little funny accounting a little bit.
Well, no, super funny accounting, because since it's a requirement,
Yeah.
we don't have to pay you.
Exactly. Right.
So they argued that this was faculty governance prerogative.
It's pretty creative.
Yes. So as teaching assistants, we're like, time out.
Right. Right.
Because, of course, anybody who's been to one of these big major state universities know, if you take French 101,
Yeah.
you're not a teaching assistant. You're the faculty.
Right.
The students don't see anybody other than
Right.
that graduate student.
Right.
So we're like, no, this is not, that's not faculty prerogative. That's not faculty governance. So don't give us that. So it generated a strike because if you gave in there, then, you know, we can do this for the whole university and then we don't have to pay teaching assistants at all.
Right, right.
So in solidarity, the union went out, our contract was up for negotiation anyway.
Yeah.
And this was just the extra impetus for making the line a hard line.
Yeah.
And I became this spokesperson within the strike. I had no intention of leadership. I was just a rabble rouser, and I ended up.
That came natural.
I had
That leadership in unions sort of it felt like.
I had been a student leader in high school. I
Okay.
had been a student leader in college.
What's the skill set you had? What's the scarce skill set you sort of had that made that sort of a good fit for you? I mean, you know, that kind of contentious, you know, antagonistic, but, you know, not backing down and negotiate. What is that? Well, you were going to be a lawyer.
I think it's who my heroes were.
Right, right.
My heroes, the people I thought were heroes, were the people who stood their ground and spoke their piece.
Right.
And those are the people I looked up to, and I thought, well, I want to emulate them.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
that's part of it. And again, if you could imagine what it took for my parents to achieve what they did, you know, there's a clear message. You have to stand your ground. You can't just back away because people will do everything to get in your way.
Yeah.
And I think the uniqueness of having been in the middle of the integration of the school system and being a minority in that system made me attuned to different divisions that were true.
Right.
So it was clear to me because I was the president of my student body in high school, that there were other divisions. The high school was located in a very working class white neighborhood, but also had very high income whites.
I see.
And you could easily see the division between the kids from the surrounding neighborhood, which at that point in time was still all white, but not wealthy white people.
Right.
And the way that the richer white kids clicked off against these working class white people.
Right.
And to me, that looked like, well, y'all have decided to click off against us. I understand that. That's obvious. But you're clicking off against these people too.
Right.
So I mean, part of that experience was just understanding that it's more complicated. Life is more complicated, and there are more allies than one might think.
Right.
If you change your focus and look at what's really going on here, not being superficial, and so.
So you're at Wisconsin.
So I'm at Wisconsin. I end up being a co-president of the teaching assistants.
Okay. As you switch to labor, what is your research about?
It's ended up being about race. I was early influenced by a piece by Robert Brown, who was the head of the Black Economic Research Center. And one of the pieces he wrote was the rapid rise of black land ownership after the Civil War peaked somewhere around 1920, 21. We have the price collapse in the agricultural sector. Black land ownership collapsed and has continued to collapse.
I see.
It's never come anywhere near, not even close, to the amount of acres that were owned by blacks in 1921.
Wow.
That fascinated me. And at that point, having moved from Washington to Virginia Beach, and you're surrounded by Southampton County, where Nat Turner staged his revolt. That's a county that's like 2 counties over. I was fascinated by that time period and the idea of, so from 0 to millions of acres of land, like how does this happen?
Right.
And the odds against which this took place.
Yeah.
So it's a rather incredible story. I found it very fascinating.
So wait, your research was directly connected to what that descriptive point that Robert Brown had made, which was this peak in African American ownership, and so you're looking at sort of this period after it. Is that right?
Well,
or even trying to explain the dip?
My work actually was on how did that happen?
How did that happen?
How did you? Because if you understand some successes, right?
Yep.
Then you get a sense for why wasn't that sustained.
What was your theory about why it happened?
So that's what my dissertation was on. But I had written a preface to it in a way. When I was an undergrad, my thesis in I double majored at Williams in political science and economics. And my political science thesis was on the Colored Farmers Alliance. And what drew me to that was the Colored Farmers Alliance was a segregated arm of the Farmers Alliance. And so here was an attempt at sort of arm's distance of how can we unite on class lines, the common interest of being farmers, and the Knights of Labor was a movement taking place at the same time. But I got all this research on the Colored Farmers Alliance, which clued me into, there are all these landowners, which isn't part of the way the history was taught.
Right.
And trying to understand how did they do that. So that was my dissertation. My dissertation was Black land accumulation, wealth accumulation from 1900 to 1915.
Wow. And that's the period of growth.
That was the most rapid period of growth, was that period. It turns out that it appeared to be very much related to the recovery of Southern banking. People forget that
Southern banking?
Southern banking.
Oh, interesting.
People forget that because of the Civil War, all the Southern banks, right, had seceded from the United States, seceded from the United States. All the gold went to Richmond at the very end of the war, and mysteriously, in the last months of the Civil War, the money was supposed to go from Richmond, and they were moving the capital, remember, down to Alabama.
Yeah.
The gold disappears. The entire gold of the Southern banking system gone. So the Southern banking system totally collapsed.
When did that happen?
1865. In April of 1865, as the Confederacy was trying to move from Richmond to Montgomery, Alabama, this money disappears. And some people have tried to write some novels about, where did all this gold go?
Right.
So it took a long time for the Southern banking system to recover.
Yeah.
When that system recovers, then credit availability expands, so that finally it's possible for these landless people to get credit and leverage buying land.
Yep. That's interesting. That's really cool.
And well, the really interesting part is the echo of all that, right? You have Booker T. Washington, and you have other leaders saying, we're agricultural workers. This is our heritage. This is where we've come from. Own that land. You must become landowners. Sound familiar? Borrow the money. Do anything. Become landowners. Well, of course, they borrowed all this money.
Heard the economic backdrop to that.
Yeah, so they borrow all this money. They become landowners. World War I comes. The prices of agricultural products goes through the ceiling. So farmers are doing well. Banks love to loan you money because now agricultural prices are going. Farmers are doing well. World War I ends. European farmers come back at the end of World War I, somewhere around 1920, 1921.
Yeah.
Agricultural prices collapse. And here are these people, heavily in debt, with no prices.
That economic history of African Americans, I feel like, is not. When I took African American literature in college, I was an English major, and I did not I did not hear that kind of economic history underlaying the history of the African American in the United States in the 20th century. That's really interesting.
Yeah, so because while it was a very dark period,
Yeah.
part of the reason for the success at being able to buy the land was that was the period when the South was becoming a transition from the 19th century to the 20th century. It was becoming more urban. The urban centers became more important.
Yeah.
And so whites were willing to leave the land.
Right. Right.
And so the ones with wealth were busy going to the cities and building up southern cities.
Yeah.
And so in my dissertation, there's the other twist to that, which was blacks were in the right place at the wrong time.
Yeah.
So one of the things—
Because of the collapse?
No, because this desire to own land, but they own land. Remember, these southern cities are small, and many of them hadn't spread out to their current borders.
Right.
So on the outskirts of many of these cities were black farms.
Yeah.
And then suddenly these cities become desirable. And we have to house all these new industrial working class whites.
Okay.
So what I found in my dissertation was there were black farms that white land developers bought and then instantly put race restrictive covenants
Oh my goodness.
when they converted them to home developments.
That was what your dissertation was about?
Well, it included that because that was the other part of what's really going on here.
Yeah.
So part of it is you had to have credit access in order to buy the rural land.
Right.
Why are you able to buy this land? Well, in part because whites are going to the cities, and the people who have the wherewithal to make the investments are now investing in cities. So you would imagine that, well, if blacks are owning all this land, why didn't they become wealthy? Because if this urban development is buying up all this agricultural land near the cities, and a lot of black farmers were truck farmers, they grew the vegetables and all that kind of stuff for the cities, why didn't they were sitting on a gold mine? And it's like, this is why.
Right.
These land developers who, thanks to the trolley, you could expand the cities further.
Yeah.
And as the trolley lines were being built, you got this pattern of investment, and these are totally new creature to the United States. These are the Levitt towns before they were Levitt towns. They put race restrictive covenants all over.
Wow. Wow.
So not only did blacks sell the land, but then it was like, but you're never coming back.
Right. So you graduate from Wisconsin.
Yeah.
You go on the job market. What year is that?
I went on the job market in '81. I had a clock in my mind.
A tenure clock?
No, not a tenure clock. I had a clock in terms of giving. So I fully understood that the fact that I got to Williams, the fact that I went to Wisconsin on an affirmative action scholarship, all of this was possible at the expense of some black people putting up an effort to make that happen.
Right.
It was
so
not
you felt an obligation of
to
public
give back.
service, right?
So I was committed. I was going to teach at HBCU.
Okay.
So in '81 I taught at North Carolina A&T, and I made the mistake. So to any young economist out there, finish your dissertation first.
Yep. Yep. Don't go ABD and leave.
Yes, do not leave ABD.
Right.
Leave with the paper. So the learning curve is steep, and especially if you're at an HBCU because the teaching load is heavy.
So heavy.
And
it was like a 4.4 or more.
It was well, in that case it was a 3.3, but because I was in the School of Business, they were accredited. It was a unique opportunity to be in a setting where they encouraged you to do research, but it really wasn't a setting to do research.
Yeah.
And to do a good job, there's extra preparation you have to do because you have to teach the students some basics. You can't just assume that they had.
Yep. And you were
dedicated to making sure that I did that.
Yep.
So there went 2 years up in smoke, so to speak.
Do you think that people at that time that are working in the historically black colleges have that Is that a common trait? That kind of, I would call that positive selection. That sort of, driven by a sense of mission. Was that? Did you come into contact with a lot of that in your colleagues?
Oh, it is, because in '81, I'm on the job market. I didn't have to teach at HBCU.
Right.
You don't have to do it.
Yeah.
So the people who are there are dedicated to making sure that they can give other people their opportunity, which is how I viewed this. Is I was given an opportunity, I have to give it back.
Right.
You can't just go off and act like you did this on your own, because you didn't. Which is, the other thing I learned from my parents. When my parents immediately got out of the service, they had to live in public housing.
Yeah.
And so they made quite clear as I was growing up, don't think you're all that in a bag of chips and you came from somewhere, because we lived in public housing. So don't give me some like you got some errors, because we didn't have it and we're not going to tolerate it, because this is not us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so my grandfather in fact had a patent.
Wow.
My grandfather on my father's side. There is a patent held by William Edward Spriggs, not me. So this is a smart guy. He was a janitor, but he's a smart guy.
Wow.
So I fully understood me being at Williams is not because of me, because his patent, right? He should have been at Williams, 70 years before I got there. Mm-hmm. So this is not about, oh, you're so smart and that's why you're there. It's like, yeah, right.
Right. Right.
So
although you're obviously very talented.
Yeah, you may be talented, but there were people who were more talented than you were before.
Sure.
So this is not about you.
Yeah.
So I felt I had to give back. And that's the clock I had, was I have to give back at least for every year I got, I have to give somebody else.
Wow, that's wonderful.
So I taught at A&T for 2 years, and fortunately for me, I had a National Science Foundation fellowship. Fortunately for me, there were very dedicated faculty at Wisconsin who were big supporters of me. Art Goldberger, who taught me econometrics.
Wow. Wait, where was he? He was your colleague?
No, he was my professor.
He was your
at
professor at Wisconsin.
Yeah,
okay.
he taught, and this is another big lesson, to Economist. You say Art Goldberger, this is like, this is the giant of econometrics.
Yeah.
So the fact that he taught first year grad students, right, for somebody that senior and that well known, that I'm going to teach first year grad students.
Right. Right, which is also driven by a sense of obligation to this generation of students.
Yes, so it was reinforced by these
Wisconsin training.
Yeah, by this Wisconsin training, because then they still had faculty, graduate faculty, who thought we're actually supposed to teach.
Yeah.
And Goldberger was fantastic, because he didn't just use his skills in econometrics to play games like some of these people today. He took on serious social issues, and at the time there was all this stuff about genetics and how this is all genetic,
like race and genetics.
Yes, and this is all genetic destiny. This stuff was already brewing, and he totally ripped it apart. Just took it into little shreds, the way that he, we feared he might do to us any moment in class.
Sure.
And so seeing him take on these folks who are supposed to be, other brilliant econometricians, and watch him just slice them up. It was like, so this is what you can do with a skill. This is not.
Right.
And there are people like that, you know. And Jeff Williamson, who, when I first got to Wisconsin, I read a paper by an economist I thought was bunk, and I wrote a response. I did research, and I handed it to Jeff Williamson. Well, I handed it to Goldberger. Goldberger said, "This is a history thing. You should give it to Jeff Williamson." I didn't know Williamson at the time, but I gave it to him. Williamson. So this was meant to be a comment that I was going to submit to the AER.
Okay.
So I think it was like maybe 12 pages. Williamson gave me back like 14 pages in red ink.
Oh, really?
So, I mean, but it was so impressive to me, like, you really read it. I mean,
Yeah,
this
right,
wasn't like
right.
some cursory, yeah, I read it, like, yeah, you're all.
He's really taking it
He
seriously.
took it seriously. He took
Yeah.
it dead seriously, and from then on, he took that same level of interest in my work and what
Wow.
I did.
Wow.
So that was helpful, and so I got the National Science Foundation Graduate Fellowship because they took interest and they wrote these strong letters
Right.
of recommendation. So fortunately for me, the way the NSF grad thing worked was you were allowed 2 years off. So I had my 2 years off, and then I used it I stopped teaching and went back to finish. And
How long? So how many years is that after you leave Wisconsin and then go back? A couple of years?
it was 2 years.
2
And then
years.
I used the NSF to finish.
Got it.
So this is
Okay.
the third year.
Got it.
Then I taught at Norfolk State because the chair of the accounting department at A&T had left to go to Norfolk State to set up their school of business. So this got me back home to Norfolk, and I stayed there for 6 years. Then my wife was an attorney, and she didn't like Norfolk, so she said, let's be in a different place. She chose Washington.
Okay.
My office mate at Wisconsin when I was a grad student was Larry Michel, who was at the time the research director at the Economic Policy Institute,
Okay.
which had been founded by labor
Yeah.
as a counterbalance against AEI and the Cato Institute. And at that point, Brookings had stopped being so impartial. Brookings was becoming more neoliberal corporatist. So they felt we don't have anybody who's really looking out for working class people and doing research.
Brookings said that?
No,
Brookings.
no, the labor movement.
The labor movement.
The labor
okay.
movement's view was the old liberal regime that we had relied on has sort of broke ranks with us, and
Right.
they're not helping policies that help working class people. They seem
Right.
to be promoting policies that are all for corporations.
Right.
So they wanted the Economic Policy Institute to look out for working people.
Got it.
But this was the late 80s. The labor movement now was reeling because the private sector throughout the 80s had been emulating what Reagan had done with PATCO, the strike against the strike by the air traffic controllers, and Reagan had replaced all the federal air
Yes.
traffic controllers.
Yes.
It's an obscure piece of a weird ruling by the Supreme Court on why the National Labor Relations Act was legal, involving some telegraph operators for a company called McKay Radio. In their ruling, the court was asked to rule because the workers felt they had been retaliated against, the workers who led the strike felt they had been retaliated against. And the Supreme Court ruled the National Labor Relations Act is legal. What the companies did was illegal. You did retaliate against the workers. The workers must be reinstated. And then they did a little footnote. And they said, this is, the fact case was, the company during the strike had hired some replacements. When the strike ended, they took back all the workers except the leaders of the strike.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court ruled, well, you could have permanently replaced all the workers. And you had the right to do that. This is a little footnote. You had the right to replace all the workers. The fact that you did not replace all the workers, the fact that you only let all the other workers back except these three strike leaders meant you retaliated against them.
Okay.
So it was a victory for labor, but that one little footnote, and it truly is a footnote,
Yeah.
became, aha, we have the right to permanently replace all strikers.
Right.
So in the 80s, this was a big problem for unions because now companies following Reagan feel the government's not going to do anything to us. Reagan did it. We can do it.
Right.
Strike activity in the U.S. collapses.
Right.
The labor movement felt they had to get a legislative fix to that court case. And so they brought me in with my labor background and my union background to do the research and make the argument for that legislation.
Yeah.
So that's why EPI wanted me, and because my office mate knew me,
Yeah.
and he says, I know the guy who can do this.
Right.
And I had to use historical records because there was no current record to let you understand this, and so my training in economic history helped.
Yeah.
And I got to be the lead witness for the Democrats on the legislation to correct this. Bill Clay was the chair of the committee at the time. And the House passed it. The neat thing was, I'm the lead expert, and the labor leader who was called to be the lead labor leader, Richard Trumka, who was the president of the United Mine Workers at the time.
Uh-huh.
Well, he was a hero of mine because if you know their history in the late 70s and kind of early 80s, they had all this strife. There was an actual civil war within the union. They were killing each other. And so this is not hyperbole, they actually killed people.
Wow.
And he stepped in to clean up the union. So he was a hero because, at the same time, here I am, this little head of a AFT local. But his bravery in the midst of this, there are real consequences here because they will kill you. His bravery to clean up this union, this is like, wow, this is, So he actually was a hero. So it was really a big deal to me that, here I am. This is the first time I'd ever testified. And on this big stage about this big piece of legislation. And here's one of my, labor heroes. So, who knew that, I would end up being the chief economist to Richard Trumka
Right.
later in life. And then, I worked on the minimum wage fights.
What year is this?
In
The
the
90s?
in the 90s, in
Okay.
the early 90s. So
After that Card & Kruger paper comes out, and then
Right.
there's like lots of discussion in DC. Okay.
Yes, and so we had a fight to raise the minimum wage under Bush, and then I went into the Clinton administration because while EPI was founded by the labor movement, it was the board was made up of all these allies of the labor movement, and EPI at the time had created the atmosphere for Bill Clinton's victory because the whole research thrust that Larry Michel had started was the 80s weren't all that good because the wages of American workers didn't go up.
Right.
And his whole message was the economy, stupid.
Right.
Run on the economy.
Right.
And that whole economy, stupid, came from the Economic Policy Institute. It was the fact that working Americans weren't benefiting.
Right.
Our wages aren't going up. The fat cats are getting fatter. Where's our piece of the pie?
Right.
And Bill Clinton wrote on that. He talked about what's happening to the typical American worker.
Right.
Where's theirs?
Yeah.
So Robert Reich
Yeah.
was a board member. He becomes the Secretary of Labor.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, if you help a campaign, then you get the goodies. So I was chosen to head the Federal Commission for Employment Policy, which was an independent agency when they created the Manpower Act, which was the big push for federally funded labor training. And the idea was an independent commission ought to be evaluating those job training programs. So even though our budget, because it was a tiny agency, even though our budget was funneled through the Department of Labor, we were an independent agency. But that meant that the Department of Labor had some say about who was going to be over at that commission.
Yeah.
So I was there, and then didn't get along very well with the person they chose to be commissioner. But there's that small window when the Democrats controlled the House, and the chair of the Joint Economic Committee became Kwesi Mfume, a black congressman from Baltimore who had inherited Perrin Mitchell's seat, had earned to replace Perrin Mitchell. And he walked into the office and he's like, "So what's wrong here? I'm the chair and nobody in this office looks like me."
Nobody looks like you.
Yeah. He's like, "How can this be?"
Right, right.
So by then I was well known in DC because I had been at the Economic Policy Institute. I had worked on minimum wage. I had worked on NAFTA.
Yeah.
I had worked on the strike replacement issue. And so I got recruited to be an economist with the Joint Economic Committee. And though I was very well known by the labor movement and labor allies, at that point I wasn't very well known in the civil rights community. So Mr. Mfume says, you know, everybody speaks very highly of you. Bill Lucy, who was the founder and head of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, was a very good mentor of mine. And so he knew Bill Lucy, and so he said, you know, people I respect say, but I have absolutely no idea who you are.
Right, right, right.
But
this is late 90s? Mid to late 90s?
This is like 93.
Oh, this is early 90s, okay.
Yeah, so he's like, but you know, these other people say you're okay, so okay. And you know, I told them find somebody, you're the one they found, so okay.
Right, right, right.
And then we became wonderful friends. He was a huge mentor to me. I felt like he was a big brother. And so I ended up being his right-hand person on economics, both on the fight for the minimum wage, which we got passed, and on protecting minority businesses, because that was the time of the Adirondack decision, and Bill Clinton had to make that famous speech about I want to mend it but don't end it, with his reference to affirmative action. Yeah. That was over the Adirondack case.
Okay.
Then, of course, the Republican Revolution happens in '94. Mr. Mfume becomes, instead of chair of the committee, just a ranking member of the committee. And the NAACP called on him to be the president of the NAACP. So he decides he'd rather be the president of the NAACP. Okay. He could do more in that position than being a minority member of Congress. Yeah. So I went back to the Clinton administration because in the response to Mend It But Don't End It, Secretary Brown of Commerce had tragically died in that plane crash, and the trade mission to the former Yugoslavia. And with him went a whole cadre of his top assistants who have been involved in Brown's pledge to carry out the research for Mend It But Don't End It.
Yeah.
So it kind of floundered for a while because the leadership for that effort was all gone.
Right.
The person who had been the deputy secretary was very devoted to Secretary Brown, wanted to fulfill Brown's promise, so was eager to have them live up to it. The person who had been the staff director for the Joint Economic Committee was the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs. That was the unit that was supposed to do this research. So he brought me over because I had worked on this issue for Congressman Mfume when Congress had to beat back efforts within the Democratic caucus to cave.
Right.
Because the Democrats were going to cave. Biden was going to cave. Joe Lieberman was going to cave. Joe Lieberman was leading the fight to cave. And so fortunately they were able to hold it, but that was Mr. Nfume's leadership to keep Democrats from taking action to end affirmative action and procurement. So I led this team over at Commerce to fulfill Brown's promise and to come up with a way that we could have a program that would meet the strict scrutiny test that the Supreme Court had put on affirmative action. Yeah. So by strict scrutiny, they meant, okay, you have an interest, we got that. Minority business ownership is very low. Utilization is low. The government should have a diverse pool of companies that compete. It's in the interest of the government to have that. Got that, but that doesn't mean your program is okay. And so you had to be able to show that it was strictly corrective. So you had to document that in accordance with firms that were willing and able to do federal contracting, the minorities were in fact not truly represented, and you had a way to correct it.
Right.
So my job was to convene some experts, listen to their approach to it, and then come up with a solution. It was eye-opening because the solution was, because of discrimination, so let me step back. You have to think of when you're doing business with the government, that's like a business-to-business transaction. A lot of people, when they talk about, black business in the black community, when they talk about black business, they'll talk about, well, why is the corner store owned by Koreans and not black people? And they're thinking about retail and business to consumer. Most of America's business is not business to consumers, it's business to business. Yeah. That is American business. That's where the money is. And the business to retail is trivial. And so because of discrimination in business to business transactions, minority firms have to seek contracts from the government and are very willing to seek contracts from the government because they're locked out of business to business. That's the business of last resort for them, is the government. And so the insight was they actually are overrepresented among the firms that want to do it. And everybody else before had just been saying, okay, this share of business is black owned, minority owned, and so they should have that share. But when you look at who wants to do government business, it's not this little share. It's a much bigger share.
Right.
So it was to document that, in fact, that's true. And so the eye-opener to me was, this is the 90s. This is like 95, 96. So I'm thinking, we'll just get some government tapes. They'll tell us who made bids. We'll match up who's the minority firms from this set of bids. Piece of cake. We'll be out of here and done in no time. There are no tapes. We don't have such data. You don't have data on who bids on government contracts? No, we don't. It's all with the individual contracting officer. So the reason why this is mind-blowing is, so my question was, how do you know they're not price fixing?
Right.
Because these decisions are made at agency level. So when the Army says, we need 500 pounds of chicken legs to feed people at Fort Lee, they don't call the Department of Agriculture. They put out a bid for that.
Yeah.
The Department of Agriculture needs 500 pounds of chicken legs to feed school lunch to the kids in Petersburg.
Right.
These agencies aren't talking to each other. So I'm like, how do you know that Purdue doesn't say, hey, you can have the Fort Lee contract, I want the Petersburg school system contract. You bid on this with the Army, and I'll bid on that with Ag.
Yeah.
Like, y'all don't have a tape to see this?
Right.
Nope, we don't. So we had to have an old-fashioned survey of all the agencies, going to their contracting officers and pulling their files, paper files, this is the mid-90s, pulling their paper files to tell us who bids on these contracts and what do they bid.
Right.
I'm like, I'm blown away.
Yeah.
And so what I thought was going to be this simple thing ended up being this hugely complex thing. But fortunately, the Clinton administration was quite concerned with this and was dedicated to it. Fortunately for me, the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors at the time was Janet Yellen. And Janet Yellen took a lot of interest in this and the approach. She thought it was a reasonable approach. I actually had to litigate this approach in front of her.
Uh-huh.
So I got to meet her and work with her on this issue. Which is a bad thing. So, so we ended up coming up with this way that then matched the information on the firms to data that was at the Census Bureau. And we were able to control for the size and the age of the firms, and then the share of those firms as represented among all possible bidders. We were able to document that indeed minority firms are way underrepresented in certain industries when it comes to winning contracts.
Right.
And the realization you have to have when you have a political job is they are temporary. I call them rent-a-jobs. So you always have to have in your mind, what's my next job? Fortunately for me at that time, the director of public policy for the National Urban League was being transitioned out, and the job became open. And this was the first time I applied for a job where I didn't know anybody. And fortunately, I was chosen. So I headed the National Urban League's office, which working for Congressman Mfume and working for Hugh Price of the National Urban League, two best jobs I ever had in my life, because they were both brilliant in their own different way, but both brilliant. And I felt I learned a lot of stuff from Mr. Mfume and a whole lot from Hugh Price. And so they were both like, big brothers to me. I didn't have a big brother. And so to me, they were like big brothers. They were the way that if you had a good big brother,
Yeah, right.
The big brother who's old enough that they're not competing with you,
Yeah, yeah.
but they can show you the path and they can give you a sense of how you get somewhere and how you can get ahead. So the Urban League job was fantastic for me because I got to pull together all of my experiences. My contacts on the Hill. When I was at the Joint Economic Committee, this is the other tragedy of the way Washington works, despite the fact that the Black Caucus is so important. Within the Hill professional staff, there are very few Black professional staff. And through a quirk, there were two of us, sort of the last two standing. So we, Pat Ruggles and I split up. She knew more people in the Senate, and I knew all these members of the CBC. So she took the Senate, and because it's a joint committee, Senate and House, and she acted as the staff director for the Senate staff herself, and I was the staff director for the House staff myself, which meant that I went to the senior meetings of the senior staff of these committees. There were only two of us. There are only two Black senior staff at the meeting. So, we're meeting with, then Dick Gephardt was the leader of the Democrats at the time. So, all of the senior committee staff, the heads of the staff are meeting, and there's just two of us.
Yeah.
Pretty sad. So, so I had lots of Hill contacts, and because of Mr. Mfume's standing, I had lots of contacts within the civil rights community. As soon as I get to the National Urban League, you know, we have all these horrible cases in New York. The Amadou Diallo case had just happened. Hugh Price, the National Urban League, is headquartered in New York, so this is a firestorm around him. He's incensed. He wants to come to Washington and, you know, make a statement. Bill Clinton has to do better by the black community than this, to let these police rampantly kill black people. And you know, in Amadou Diallo's case, you know, it was a horrible case in which he was a person waiting on a ride in the vestibule of his apartment building.
Right. And
the police, I don't remember how many bullets it was, 80 bullets or whatever, filled the man with bullets under horrible pretense. And of course he was unarmed.
Yeah.
So
one of many similar stories.
yes, and at the time that was the cause celeb, and so because of my ties, I was able to put together this news conference, which you had asked me to do.
Yeah.
And of course I knew Mr. Mfume, so I got the NAACP instantly on board. I had worked with Jesse Jackson. He was instantly on board, and you know, the picture of this news cast of the event looks like the Hall of Fame at the moment. Johnny Cochran, we had people outside of politics. Ed Lewis, who headed up Essence magazine at the time. Reverend Lowry, we had people from the original SCLC. Reverend Lowry was there. And so it's this fantastic coming together press conference that we were able to pull off. But because now I had lots of connections, and I was able to leverage that. And because Hugh was dedicated to having a sound basis for positions the National Urban League took, he gave me free rein and making sure I would have people in place who could do the research, who could make the case for public policies that made sense.
Right.
I was always irritated. There were only two of us who had the job of representing Black America. Hillary Shelton, who did the NAACP, and me, who did the National Urban League. Initially, because I hadn't done lobbying, I mean, I had been lobbied when I was on the Hill as a staffer, but I'd never done lobbying. Wherever Hillary Shelton went, I went, because I figured, well, I'll learn from him.
Yeah.
Then it dawns on me, the NAACP is in this meeting, the Urban League is in this meeting. This is one room. All the other policies happening in America right now, there is no Black person in the room.
Right.
No one. Welfare reform, criminal justice, Black farmers complaining about violations and discrimination, nothing. There's nobody in those other rooms. So then it became, whatever room Hillary's in, I have to be in a different room. Initially people were like, oh, you don't like Hillary Shelton. They thought we had a falling out. It's like, we didn't have a falling out.
Yeah.
It just dawned on me that unless for some unknown reason he needs me, I don't need to be in the room. He's going to say what I'm going to say. All I'm going to do is say
Just
amen.
spread y'all around.
Yes.
You needed even more than just the two of y'all.
Yeah, and
Right.
me saying amen is not.
Yeah.
Because they know I'm going to say amen to whatever he says. I'm not going to go in the room and say, you know, the NAACP sucks. I mean, this is not happening, right?
Yeah, right.
So I have to be in some other room on something else that's happening. So I would always get, you know, infuriated because you would be on the press and I would be watching the news and people would be saying, these civil rights groups, all they care about is blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, you didn't ever talk to me. I don't even know who you are. So how are you saying what I do
Right.
when you don't know me
Yeah.
and I have no clue who you are?
Right. Right.
And so, I mean, many people were surprised, right? I mean, I would be at meetings on what's tax policy going to be? I would be at meetings. Well, obviously, welfare reform was important at the time. Welfare reform, trade. So I really got irritated at what people thought that Hillary and I did. But given that there were only two of us, it also irritated me that they assumed they knew what we did, and could just pontificate about this, and the press would just eat this up like, why are you eating this up? This is total fairyland. So I did that job for 6 years, and I felt, again, this was sort of giving back, and sort of the ultimate, right, of giving back in the sense that teaching at A&T and at Norfolk State gave other people knowledge that I had acquired, but this was me actually working for the type of organization that got me the chance that I had in my life in the first place. Right. And being able to use those skills to advocate, to give other people a chance, not just the ones who would be sitting in a classroom with me. Right. Working for Hugh Price was ideal. It was wonderful. But when he left, then it was time for me to do something different. I went back to the Economic Policy Institute briefly to help with the fight on Social Security because Bush had loaded both barrels to try and privatize George W. His second term, he thought, was a mandate to change Social Security, and so I contributed a lot to that because people thought they could use, particularly the black community, as a wedge because black life expectancy is so short, and the way they would always sell this is as, oh, you black people get cheated. You don't even reach retirement. Don't you want your money in a private account? Because otherwise you don't get any money. This way, at least when you die, you get something. Of course, this is a total misunderstanding of the program. It is an insurance program. It is not a retirement program. Only 1 in 3 people work all their lives, get to 65, and then get retirement benefits on their own work history. Right. The rest of the people either become disabled before they reach 65 and draw disability, or they are a spouse, and because of gender discrimination in pay, end up drawing a benefit based on their husband's benefit. So they're actually getting an insurance. They're not getting from their own work record. So this characterization that I can privatize it because you just pay into it and then you retire, it's like, this is not how it works. The median age for a black person getting a Social Security check, something like 59 or 58, it's not even 61, because people forget, right? The survivor benefit, when you die, there are these kids, disproportionately, those are black kids because disproportionately the people who die are black. And so people were totally forgetting there are a lot of black kids who get a Social Security check because they're the survivor of a worker. Right. And then they forgot that disproportionately black workers have the type of job where we become disabled and we draw disability. So by actually putting data in front of people and pointing out, how are you going to address this? Because if you go on savings, these kids are getting nothing. Right. We don't make anything, and when we die, you can divide up this little bit of money, but you will not be able to approach the benefits that these children get. And for a disabled worker, forget it. There's no way that their savings account is going to cover what they get through disability. So you have no answer if you say you want to privatize this thing for how black people experience the program, which then brought in a big window for people to get to talk about the workers, most of whom are white, disproportionately they're black, but most of whom are white, who are disabled, who have disabilities. And it opened up a conversation about another set of people, again, who are mostly white, who are disabled as children, and when they reach adulthood, those people who are adults are drawing a benefit based on their parents.
Is it that there's a level of indifference to the Black American experience that makes that privatization argument, more compelling than it would be if, than it is to you? Is it that they are just indifferent to the way in which, lower income African Americans are depending on these systems, or is it some other rationalization around it?
It's ignorance.
Yeah.
It's because in the past, the approach taken by other scholars in response to this issue had been, well, it may be true that at birth blacks have a much shorter life expectancy.
Yeah.
However, if you look at people who make it to retirement,
Yeah.
the gap in black life expectancy and white life expectancy is very short. It's like a year, maybe. I don't know if it's a full year, if you make it that far.
Yeah.
And that's how it had been argued. I think it was having a black scholar look at the program from a different lens,
Right.
brought a totally different argument. Because this was a dear friend of mine who had argued on behalf of black people this issue about, but you got to think about it from the perspective of given.
Yeah.
When you reach retirement, this isn't discriminatory. And they had just glossed over
Yeah.
this bigger issue.
Right.
And there's a sense among too many in the policy arena that white people get to speak on behalf of black people.
Right.
In the interest of black people. And they get so used to it, and they get so used to, okay, now we're going to have the adult conversation. The
So
black conversation.
You need to leave.
Yes. The kiddie table is,
Right.
oh, you guys, you're poor. You need job training. Okay, let's talk about job training. But if it's a big economic policy like
Right.
Social Security or tax policy, this is now the adult table.
Yeah.
Go away.
Right.
Even though this is going to impact you in some grossly disparate impact way,
Yeah.
go away. This is not your table.
It seems like we're coming a little bit full circle, because I'm thinking back to that initial conversation with your neighbor who had said you could do more as an economist than as a lawyer. And I keep thinking there is a young man or a young woman right now in that exact same situation, and they do not have a neighbor telling them that. And you're describing it, like, let's assume that there is a non-trivial amount of ignorance, giving the benefit of the doubt. Just there's an amount of ignorance, and there's ignorance about the African American experience, and as well as this condescension, which could also have some, ignorance in it also. What are you going to say? What is the piece of information that you would give to this hypothetical neighbor, to a young man or young woman, to help them know this might be a better calling for you than the counterfactual?
Yeah. Well, I think this is still true. What is clear in American life is that the way that race impacts so many aspects of life is that it is virtually impossible to have a program be race neutral. It is virtually impossible. Unless you truly look at it and take it apart. If you give credit for black agency, so that you understand that black people are acting positively to try and overcome something, and then when you look at it from that lens, you begin to understand the myriad ways in which race comes into play. And so unless somebody does that, you're going to replicate racial disparity. And even when you think you're being well-intentioned.
Yeah.
So, I'll give an example again. When they cut the deal on the drug provisions for Medicare.
Right.
We have been in coalition. The National Urban League is a big player in the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. But AARP, feeling that this is their bailiwick because they're representing seniors, had negotiated on our behalf and there's a donut. So their impression was, look, we said if you're below the poverty line, you're covered. It's just between the poverty line and this other arena where you got to chip in.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, the majority of black people are not poor. The majority are not poor. However, the majority are just above poverty.
Right.
So when it is true that disproportionately we're poor, and so it is true that when you said, I'll make the line at the poverty line, you help a disproportionate share of black people, you punish the majority of black people because they're just above the poverty line,
and you're not eligible for this.
Yes, and so you're making us pay a disproportionate share of our income for this drug benefit.
Right, right.
And so, here's a well-intentioned ally, but unless you really study it, you're going to make these kind of mistakes.
Right.
And I see that repeated again and again and again and again and again, where people think, oh, I dealt with poor people, so therefore I helped you out, so go away.
Right.
And their unwillingness to engage that's sloppy. There's a lot more work you got to do.
Right, right.
So,
so you're basically saying, if I can summarize what you're saying, is this young African American man or woman, there's a real opportunity cost to them not coming in, not just for their own, meaningful, that it's a meaningful career and things like that, but since the rules of the game are being set, and there's not an African American young man or young woman there to really inform it, it's just not going to correct itself through some kind of invisible hand.
Exactly.
Right.
What I tell my students is, it's not their problem. So you're asking somebody else to solve your problem.
Exactly. Yeah.
And as well-intentioned as people are, they don't solve your problem.
Right.
And if you're not going to step in, it's not going to happen. Because it's every policy, there's no policy that you can design this way unless somebody designs it that way. The reality is, if you go to Washington, I don't care what meeting you're in on, and I don't care what they're discussing. I don't care if they're discussing something very important to black people, like criminal justice.
Right.
There's going to be one black person in the room at most. And in most cases, there are no black people in the room.
Yeah.
So the idea that there's somebody else solving this and they'll solve it's like, no, this is not happening. It's not. And so I cannot say like my neighbor did, oh, we already won all the battles. It's like, no.
Yeah.
We haven't even touched all the battles. We haven't even touched
it's a long fight.
It's a long fight, and it's going to take a lot of people, and there aren't a lot of people. That's the problem. There are not a lot of people.
Right. So I have one last thing. There's that metaphor of these blind men. They're all standing by an elephant, and one person's holding the tail and thinks it's a rope, and one person thinks the trunk is or they think the leg is a tree trunk, and all these things. And I was wondering, speaking back to this ignorance issue, what is it that economists, if you think of the economists as these blind men, and they're standing against this thing and they're confused, what are the what is it in the profession that you think most of the profession simply is incorrect about when it comes to the history of race and the racism within the profession? What is it that what's the fundament, what are some of the main sources of confusion?
Their refusal to be as meticulous on the issue of race as they are with any other variable. If you ask an economist, why did you put in that variable? They will tell you with precision, I put in that variable because it measures this.
Yeah.
Okay, you put race in. What does it measure? That's going to be their answer. The reality is, in the United States, race is a legal and legally binding thing. Now, we have ruled against using the law to create or recreate that binding thing. But if you're truly an economist, then you would understand, right? Well, people use the law as a means to do what the law was doing. The law said the United States of America, land of equal opportunity and equal law, except there are a class of people defined by this thing called race that we may deny.
Yeah.
Housing, where you can sit, where you can go to school, where you can be buried, where you can live.
It's a real laziness
It's a real laziness
with regards to thinking carefully about these things that we're supposed to be so smart, such smart people.
Well, it's an unwillingness to take on what that variable actually measures.
Right.
Because if you appreciate that it's a legal definition, then you would have to say there's discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
That violates economic principles. So economists have a definition of rational.
Yeah.
A rational person must act to be a utility or profit maximizer. If you care about something that is not related to productivity, like race, you're not rational. So for a white economist looking at racial disparity, this means you would have to say, if you believe there was discrimination, that most white people are not rational. They're not going to say that.
Right.
It is easier to say, if I see a racial disparity, it's not that white people aren't rational, it's something deficient about black people.
Right. Yeah.
So somebody is irrational here,
Yeah.
and I got to assign blame. It is not in the nature of a profession where black people tend not to be, to want to say, well, there are lots
These
of
are subtle forking paths. You sort of make these early decisions, and they just really, they start off small, and they kind of lead you in eventually into very dramatically different research agendas and conclusions, and ultimately the designing of policy.
Exactly. And a problem is the way the profession now has become over-obsessed with identification.
Yeah.
If I make a claim that this is collusion and that this is a system which I can document 100 and many years,
Right.
where these laws were in place and had real meaning, and that's the meaning of race, and what you are observing is either, if you look back in history, yeah, you know what? Somebody passed this law and it achieved what the law meant to do.
Yeah.
And the fact that the law says, oh, you shouldn't do that, it means that somebody else has figured out, well, we can achieve that without a law.
Right.
I can't identify it, right? This
Right.
is a power structure. So
Without any quasi-randomization.
I can't randomize it.
Right.
Yeah, I can't
Especially with that potential outcomes framework, as you said earlier, where you have to have manipulation. And you've heard Don Rubin and others say, I can't manipulate race. I remember Don Rubin saying one time, what does that mean? Is that manipulating the hue of the skin color? And it's this, in some ways, this binding, handcuffing that if you commit to the, I've written a book on, causality, and so I completely understand and appreciate it, but it can be a real, it can force you to ask only certain kinds of questions.
That's
and then ignore other kinds of questions completely because you're not able to obtain an answer in the way that you've defined what an answer is.
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, and race is one of those. Other institutional factors are the rest of them, like unions.
Yeah.
You try and argue to everybody. So when productivity and wages rose together, America had high union density. Ever since we've had low union density, productivity and wages aren't related.
Right.
When productivity and wages were related, We increase the minimum wage constantly in relation to the median wage. Ever since we stopped doing that, productivity and wages aren't related. Yes, but that's correlation.
You could imagine, though, the $1 million question being, if I could find, you would say to some young person, if you could find a way to ever find quasi-random, I don't know in this case, but it would be extremely valuable, given that so many people can only hear those kinds of answers.
Yeah, so I mean, some people have done that when it comes to race because Sandy Darity and some others have done this colorism thing.
Yep.
They, I think, miss the opportunity to understand that while they think it's colorism, it really is a chance to think about this as a random experiment. Right. Because what's really happening is I'm getting a group of people who are fuzzy.
Yep.
Someone looks at them and they're not quite sure.
And so two people look at them and come to different conclusions.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the fact that someone who is very light-skinned gets a favorable outcome, I don't think is so much that they're being favored because they're light-skinned. I think they are running into more instances where in the moment I got to make up my mind about something, I don't know. Yeah. There are more people going, I don't know what he is.
Yep. My advisor, Chris Cornwell at the University of Georgia, apparently there's a Brazilian data set that he used, and going between firms, the race will switch.
Right.
And it's some sort of passing phenomenon.
Yes,
and
exactly.
They identified wage differences for those people. When they are passing, apparently their wage is higher.
Yes.
And you've got some switching, to fit that Don Rubin thing. So it's not impossible. It does require very, I don't know if we have to replicate that experiment too many times for it to be believable, but there is a lot of value to, if only just because some people, they can no longer hear without those kinds of things. And,
but it's also hard because those experiments help you to understand that what we're talking about is possible.
Yeah.
But the general equilibrium effects get missed. So when you bring it to scale, right, I've created a different world. So a world in which I have these hard race lines is a different world. The world in which unions can function is a different world. And especially I'll use unions because it's way clearer, right? When there are unions, there's a credible threat that protects all workers.
Right.
So the general equilibrium difference between the 35% union density and the current 7%, it's kind of hard. I mean, economists do this now where they say, I can do a regression discontinuity where, it's a close union election and it could have been either way. Like, that doesn't totally capture the union effect.
Right. Because it's just that local average. It's that local average treatment effect in the first place.
Yes,
right.
and so that gives me a clue that yes, unions matter.
Right.
They definitely matter.
Right.
And even the work that Spriggs and I do and some of the others that he's worked with, have been able to document that unions used to organize a higher share of low-skilled workers, and those low-skilled workers used to get much higher wages back then. It still doesn't get you all of the things unions do. I mean, what we have found, a low union density state spends less on K-12 education, less likely to have workers who have health insurance, more likely to lock people up. There are these other dynamics that come into play, and so it isn't just, I took away unions and I found out in this discontinuity study that unions raise wages 3%, like, and only for union members. It's like, okay, but that's
right. Yeah. Well, we could talk all night. I could ask you questions all night.
Yeah, we got to get ready.
We got to get
dinner.
to dinner.
Yep.
So I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Gonna see us through. Honey, you need me, baby.